Okay, so when you think of Paris, what's the first thing that pops into your head? The Eiffel Tower, right? Maybe the Louvre? Well, today we're going to head a little off the beaten path into one of its most exclusive neighborhoods. And trust me, this place has some unbelievable, world-changing stories to tell.
We're talking about the Monceau district. You know, back in the 19th century, this was the spot. Bankers, industrialists, artists, I mean, you name it, they were here. So in this explainer, we're going to dig into how this kind of quiet, unassuming neighborhood became a launchpad for massive revolutions in art, business, and, yep, even in the words we use every day.
I mean, it sounds kind of nuts, doesn't it? But stick with me here, because that is exactly what happened. The story of Monceau is just incredible. It's all about how a handful of innovators, literally living just doors apart from each other, completely changed the world in ways we're still feeling right now.
All right, so first up, let's dive into the world of art. Because right here, in a spot you would never ever expect, the entire rulebook for what art was supposed to be was just completely torn up and rewritten from scratch.
So, picture this. You're walking down a street in Paris today, and you pass this building. It's a Japanese restaurant. There's no plaque, nothing to tell you about its history. It just looks normal. But this very spot once housed the studio of Édouard Manet, and from a room upstairs, right there, he unleashed a shockwave that rattled the entire art establishment to its core.
You see, back then, the official Paris Salon, they were the gatekeepers. They decided what was good art, and what they wanted were these huge, dramatic, historical scenes. You know, flawless-looking Greek gods, that kind of thing. But Manet, he was inspired by his friend, the poet Charles Baudelaire, and he had a totally different idea. He wanted to paint modern life just as he saw it, raw, real, and happening right now.
So when Manet unveiled his painting Luncheon on the Grass in 1863, oh man, people lost their minds. They were absolutely horrified. And look, the scandal wasn't really the nudity, that was all over academic art. The real shocker was that she was a contemporary woman, and she was staring right back at you, the viewer. She's sitting there with these two guys in modern clothes, and it just felt way too real for comfort.
And Manet didn't stop there. Oh no. 2 years later, he did it again with his painting Olympia, which showed a very well-known Parisian courtesan posing like a modern Venus, and that caused an even bigger uproar. So by just shattering all the rules, he basically became the reluctant leader of a whole new generation of artists, the Impressionists, and kicked off the entire modern art movement, all from that one little studio in Monceau.
But here's the thing. Manet wasn't the only one shaking things up in the neighborhood. At the exact same time he was busy rewriting the rules of art, another Monceau resident was starting a totally different kind of revolution, a commercial one, with consequences that would literally span the globe.
Okay, let me introduce you to Angelo Mariani. He's a local pharmacist with a really brilliant idea. He thought, let's combine red wine, everyone thinks that's healthy, with coca leaf extract, which was famous for its energizing properties. The result? A drink called Vin Mariani. And you can basically think of it as the Red Bull of the 19th century.
But the drink itself was only half the story. See, Mariani was an absolute marketing genius. What he did was he sent free bottles of his wine to all the biggest names of the day. We're talking famous authors, actors. He even sent some to the Pope. And then he took their glowing reviews and plastered them all over his ads. It was, no joke, the world's very first influencer marketing campaign.
And this is where the story takes a really wild turn. So Vin Mariani becomes this huge hit, including over in America. An Atlanta pharmacist, a guy named John Pemberton, decides to create his own version of it. But then, bam, Prohibition hits his county, and he's got to pivot fast. So he swaps out the wine for soda water, and just like that, Coca-Cola is born, a direct descendant of that little Parisian tonic.
And speaking of America, another big fan of Vin Mariani was the sculptor Auguste Bartholdi. And it turns out that just a few streets away from Mariani's pharmacy, Bartholdi was working on a rather large project in the workshops of a company called Gadget, &C. You might have heard of it, the Statue of Liberty. So get this, when the statue was finally inaugurated, the owner of the foundry, a man named Émile Gadget, he handed out these little miniature souvenir replicas, and they were stamped with his name, Gadget. Now, English speakers, they couldn't quite wrap their tongues around the French pronunciation, so they started calling these little trinkets gadgets. And that, right there, is how a Parisian workshop gave us the word we use for every clever little device today. Isn't that wild? Okay, so we've had art and world-changing inventions. Now, let's turn to a man who was maybe the ultimate symbol of the district's contradictions, an industrial titan who also had the heart of a revolutionary.
Take a look at this. This was the mansion of Émile Menier. And let me tell you, it was considered shamelessly, shockingly over-the-top rich, even for the wild tastes of that era. And the guy who built this palace, he made his fortune on something we all know and most of us love, the chocolate bar.
Yeah, the Menier family basically invented the modern chocolate bar. They took it from being this bitter medicine and turned it into the sweet treat we know today. And Émile, he was a total business visionary. He controlled everything, from the cacao plantations in Nicaragua to his own fleet of ships to the factories. It's a strategy we now call vertical integration. At his peak, the man controlled over half the world's cocoa trade.
But here's the twist. This mega capitalist was also a groundbreaking social pioneer. I'm not kidding. For his 2,000 factory workers, he built an entire model town. We're talking cottages with gardens, a hospital, a retirement home. He even made school mandatory for the workers' children, long before it was the law in France. He was truly decades ahead of his time.
And this gets to the deep, deep contradiction of Émile Menier. On the one hand, politically, he was a radical leftist, a champion for social reform and workers' rights. On the other hand, his personal lifestyle was pure ultra-capitalist. He lived in one of the most ridiculously extravagant mansions in all of Paris. He was a total paradox, a man living by two completely different and kind of conflicting sets of rules.
So what happened? Well, eventually the Menier Empire began to fade. After World War II, American GIs brought their sweet, milky chocolate to Europe. Public taste started to change, forever. And the dark, rich, bittersweet chocolate that had made Menier a king, well, it just kind of fell out of fashion. So, after all that, what's left of this incredible era today? Well, the spirit of Monceau and the legacy of all these amazing people, it's still woven right into the very fabric of Paris.
You know, the heart of the district, Parc Monceau, it actually started out as the private Disneyland of an 18th century duke. He basically built himself an adult playground complete with a fake Egyptian pyramid and fake ancient Roman ruins. It eventually became a public park, but it's never really lost that exclusive, slightly strange, aristocratic vibe.
And that unique atmosphere, it was so powerful that the district itself basically became a character in some of France's greatest novels. You have Émile Zola, who used all the showy speculative wealth as the perfect backdrop to satirize the new elite. And then there's Marcel Proust, who immortalized the neighborhood's social scene and the park itself as this beautiful, haunting landscape of childhood memory.
So when you put it all together, Monceau was so much more than just a rich neighborhood. It was a true laboratory for the modern world. It was a place where artistic rebellion took root, where commercial empires were born, and where the quiet streets literally became an engine of modernity whose impact we still feel all over the globe. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many other secrets that shaped our world are still hiding out there, in the quiet streets of our own cities? What world-changing stories are waiting to be discovered, not in some famous museum, but maybe just around the corner, on a street you walk down every single day?